Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the people in the room at this magnificent school, Beaucamp, and this great hall. Welcome to the people who are live streaming. We welcome all of you. We're here to present our tax review proposals, which will be debated by the States of Guernsey in January of next year. On the panel, myself as President of Policy and Resources, I'll kick off. Then also my colleague from Policy and Resources, Deputy Dave Mahoney, will take you through some of our slides and some of the presentation. Then another colleague from Policy and Resources, Deputy John Lattock, will do likewise. And last but certainly not least, Deputy Peter Roffey, President of Employment and Social Security, will also address matters. Then it'll come back to me for a summary. Let's just see where we are. Nobody really wants to be where we are. Nobody wants to be in a position whereby we're going to be saying to our colleagues in the States of Guernsey in less than 2 months that we're going to have to make a radical change to our tax system. But we are in a position of no return. We will run out of money in the next few years. Not tomorrow, not next year, possibly not the year after. But we are in a position whereby in a very short period of time, we will not be able to pay all the bills. Now that's been caused because people are living longer. We've got a smaller working population. We've incurred a lot of expense over the years, but what we haven't done is invested in our infrastructure. So we're in a position whereby if we do not take the decision, and it'll be a difficult decision that none of us really want to take, but we believe that there is no necessity, no option but to take it, and it is a matter of necessity that we do take it, then there'll be significant cuts in our services that will have to be made in early course. They'll be dramatic. Some of those are detailed in the policy letter, and I appreciate that the policy letter has only been out a short time and you've probably not had much or a great opportunity in considering it. But as I say, we are in a position whereby we genuinely believe, having gone through a long consultation, that there is no realistic alternative to what we're proposing. Now, I'm going to start with the first slide, or it says slide 2, that's just to confuse you, but it's actually the first active slide. And this sets out, these are the headline matters. Now, what we're proposing is that there be a 15% tax band rather than a 20% tax band on income up to £30,000. So that means once you've had your personal allowances, including any, say, mortgage relief that you may have on your income, the rest of your income up to £30,000 will be taxed at the basic rate of 15%. Now, also, we will be giving an increase of £600 in the personal tax allowance. Now, our social security contributions, which Peter Roffey will speak much more ably and knowledgeably than me, are such that the system needs radical overhaul anyway, and the States a year or so ago decided that that was the way it wanted to move. But Peter will detail what that means when he addresses some of the slides later on. And of course, the headline that everybody will report and everybody will be interested in is 5% GST. Now, 5% GST, if the States approve 5% GST, it would not be implemented till about April 2025. We'll detail in the slides how that will be dealt with. There'll be very few exemptions, but the whole ethos behind our proposals is that those who cannot afford to make any greater contribution in relation to tax will not have to do so, and those that can afford to do so will have to do so. As I say, we've looked at every contingency. We'll go through those in the slides. We welcome the opportunity at the end of this presentation for your questions. Now, again, I think I've touched upon this under our proposed new tax system. Most lower and middle households will be better off, not massively, but they'll be better off compared to now. Now, bearing in mind we're talking about a tax situation whereby we need more tax, we think that that is a significant step forward in relation to what we are able to do. Those who are able to pay more should pay more. They will share a greater tax burden and they will make a greater contribution towards our needs. Now, there'll be less reliance on income tax from working islanders to fund all the services, because in one of the slides you will see just how we are dependent on income tax to make our contributions. Now, our working population has shrunk in recent years. Our elderly population has grown. We cannot keep imposing income tax burdens, extra income tax burdens on the working population. And now the essence of it is to secure healthcare, because the greatest increase in recent years has been on healthcare. For example, and this is just one for example, and I voted for this, we're going to be spending very soon, every year, £5 million on nice drugs. So that's an extra £5 million every year. And also we've got to provide decent old age pensions and essential services for the generations going forward. Now, people say they already pay enough tax, and people do pay a significant amount of tax. But in Guernsey, we pay approximately 22% of our gross domestic product in relation to tax. You compare that with our neighbours in Jersey, where that figure is 26%. Now, if you were to prorate that, because obviously we're 60-odd thousand people and there are 100-odd thousand people, we would have to increase our tax take, or we could increase our tax take by £100 million per annum, and we would be taxing our population at no higher rate than those in Jersey. But as I say, these are decisions we don't want to make, but decisions we believe we've got no option. Now, this slide shows who's going to be better off, who's going to be worse off. Now, you can see that those who are with the lowest income or on benefits will be the best off. They will pay less. They will definitely pay less. We're not saying it's going to transform them into millionaires, because it isn't, but it's a situation whereby they will be marginally better off. And you can see, for example, even two adults with a £50,000 per annum income in that family will be marginally better off. Where it switches is about when we get to the 60 to 64% income percentile. And two adults with £75,000 going into their home will pay, under this system, about an extra 0.2 or 0.25% overall in tax. And if you go jump a couple of slides along that slide to two adults with £100,000 income, as you can see, they'll be paying just over 1% extra in tax. Those that will pay the most will be what we've termed the richest 5%, and we believe that that is fair and equitable as to how that should proceed. So we have done the absolute best. We accept that GST in itself, if that was alone, is a regressive tax. We fully accept that those people who are in the lower income percentiles must be protected, and therefore we balance that in our considerations. Now, this is rather a heavy slide, and I don't expect all of you to be able to assimilate it straight away. But what it shows is that our population is having less children and we're living longer. 50 years ago or thereabouts, in 1971, we had relatively few people living beyond the age of 75. If you look at where we are now-ish, of 2020, you can see that that's changed significantly. And if you look where we're going to be in less than 30 years, 2050, that's even more marked. Our working population has shrunk. We have less people to keep more people. And we have less people to pay for the services that we all believe that we need. It's a sad fact, well, it's a good fact, because people are living longer, but they need greater health care. The average person aged 70 has to have 4 times more spent on their health care than the average person who's 35. And our population is ageing in that regard. And the last slide before I pass over to Deputy Mahoney is where we are already. Already, next year, 2023, we're budgeting for a £58 million structural deficit. Now, that takes account of what we need to be spent on pensions, care, and infrastructure, because we in Guernsey, and I'm not blaming my regime, the previous regime, or the regime before that, but the fact is we have not spent enough money on our infrastructure. We have a resolution of the states whereby we are supposed to spend 2% of our GDP every year on infrastructure. That's about £60 million, where we're clearly not doing that. And if we don't do that, eventually your harbours need work, your schools need work, you need to improve sewage systems and the like. We will not be able to do that. And you can see how those figures increase rapidly. By 2025, which is only, 2 to 3 years off, the annual structural deficit will be £70 million. And by 2040, which is not a long time away in government and planning circumstances, the deficit will be between, and this is without inflation, this is at today's prices, will be between 100 and 110 million pounds. So that's where we are. And I actually think that figure could be higher, because we have things that we've not been able to put into that calculation, which if we took them on board would mean that that figure of 70 million, 110 million, whatever it would be significantly higher. Anyway, I'll pass over now to my colleague, Deputy Mahoney.
Thank you, Peter. The first thing actually I'm going to do is talk about how we're going to, one of the ways we're going to do this. Now, maintaining the size of the workforce is obviously very important. And I'm actually going to skip back 2 slides to start off with. And this slide that Peter has touched on already. And what we can see here across the 3 slides is the bulges getting higher up. And really that's just the baby boomers are retiring effectively. So naturally more and more people are retiring, and there aren't enough people coming in at the bottom as shown there to fill the gap and effectively start paying the taxes to pay for those people at the top of those charts there. Now, a slide will come up shortly that Deputy Tock will talk to, our reliance on income taxes. So I'm certainly not going to steal any thunder from John, but they will show how incredibly heavily reliant Guernsey is as a jurisdiction on income-based taxes. Now, of course, if you flicked back to those, the more people we have retiring and the fewer people we have paying tax, then that just exacerbates the situation to a point where it's not sustainable. So how are we going to sort that out? Increased migration. These next 2 points actually should be taken together. The states recently, 2 months ago, approved the new population workload in terms of a net migration of 300 extra people into the island for the next 30 years as a target. Now, of course, with that comes a lot of problems. We currently have a housing shortage right now, here and today, but those are issues that we just have to deal with. We need the income taxpayers coming into the island, and obviously we will have to deal with the housing situation as and when that arises. Not much more we can do there. In terms of what else are we going to get money from? So we've spoken about GST. It was on the first slide, second slide. Now, part of the way that we can get some more money is the tax from businesses. Now, Ernst & Young did a very extensive and thorough review of this over a 3-month period earlier in the year. That review, the instruction they were given was that it was a blank page with nothing off limit, and they should come back to us and report on everything possible. Second point there, you see the potential is to raise up to £20 million a year from taxes, from corporate tax. Now, that is 20 million on top of the numbers that Deputy Le Toc will come to shortly in a few moments. And now, £10 million of that would potentially be under Pillar 2 of the OECD anti-BEPS stuff. I'm not going to go into too much detail at this point. It's all in the policy letter, very, very detailed. And £10 million from other fee increases across corporates on island currently are at the moment. Now, we have been consulting with the industry, and we've already had meetings with GIBA, the Chamber of Commerce, retailers, the Institute of Directors, and indeed I think there are some other meetings happening this week with other bodies. So this hasn't been us just going out and thinking we know best. We have been consulting with all of these bodies that know their industries better than we do. And of course the Crown Dependencies, Deputy Fairbrush attended the British and Irish Council this month, Fida, just a few weeks ago, and met there with the Chief Ministers of Jersey and the Isle of Man as well. So we are doing a cross-Crown dependency consultation on this. Now, that review that EY did, as I say, it was very extensive, but what it didn't find was any mechanism for raising a large amount without risking damage, and this is incredibly important. Everyone, I'm sure, in the room and online will agree that our finance industry is what's laying all the golden eggs at the moment, and we really do have to protect that pretty much at all costs. It's paying for most of the bills at the moment. So controlling public spending, this is the big one that quite rightly, indeed, that we've received many questions and suggestions from the other deputies in the Assembly around this matter, and they have been listened to, and we are still in conversations with many people about that. What people are saying, of course, the biggest accusation is that we need to counter some of the cost increases and stop spending more and more money. Now, some of those issues, and in fact some of the bigger issues, the state's pension that you, me and everyone else hopefully will receive. Now, some of the things are formula-led, so there isn't actually very much we can do about that. So as you get older, you're entitled, as you retire rather, you're entitled to your state pension, and there are formula for how much you will get. And a health budget, of course, which is our largest budget by committee, by and large, we have to protect. It's not something from the health side where we can just begin closing things down willy-nilly. And of course, the problem with the ageing demographic is that the health costs are one of those areas that are growing quicker than anywhere else. So it's a kind of a double whammy. We have to protect it, but it is the area that's growing fastest in terms of cost. We will be proposing tighter restrictions, and they are in the policy letter. There are some fairly detailed ones in there. Appreciate from what Peter said, it was only issued today, so very, very few people will have had a chance to read it properly yet. But I urge anyone that is really interested in it to have a look through that. It's really not that long, but there are some firm ideas of what needs to be tightened up in there, and that's what we will be looking for the various committees to take on. And the final point on the slide there is the government work plan. Now, Deputy Murray, and I want to stress the importance that Deputy Murray will play in this, he is now intended and committed to looking at that work plan immediately. Bob starts his job first thing tomorrow morning with us. So he will be looking at the government work plan and everything in it. It is still too large. I think the Assembly did a pretty good job to cut it down from what it was, but it is still far, far too large. And Bob's role in the first instance will be looking at and to a certain extent tearing a big chunk off of it and being realistic about what we can actually do and what we can actually afford. I'll hand over to Deputy Stock.
Thanks, Dave. I've got the most exciting slides, I think. Dave has explained, Deputy Mahoney has explained, I think, the sorts of things, if I can put it in my language, that we ought to be doing anyway, or that we have to do because of changing international standards and situations surrounding us. I'm now going to take you through, if I can, what we've effectively, once we've done that, what we've actually said in the end, what we need to narrow down, what we need to raise in terms of new taxation if we've done all of those other things as well. And we've narrowed it down basically to 50 to 60 million annually of taxes that we need to raise. And we will raise them from, first of all, from businesses. And if you speak to many people on the issue, on this particular issue, and we've done a lot of that, quite a lot of men and women in the streets say, well, we should be taxing businesses more. They're the ones that have benefited the most from 0-10, etc. And what we're proposing will do exactly that, but without risking our businesses going elsewhere. We're able to do that with the proposals that we're putting forward. And we're able to raise 27 million each year in new taxation from businesses. And those are, if you like, perhaps who have benefited the most from the changes that we brought in over a decade ago. We will be obviously looking to get income from households as well, and the Chief Minister has already touched on some of those things. We're looking to raise 23 million from taxes that will affect households, but also we will be looking to raise another 6 million from visitors to the island. In a sense, at the moment, there are many people that come visit our island, whether on business or on leisure, and they use our services, our facilities, they drive on our roads, all of that, and they don't pay or contribute to those services and systems. So we are looking to raise money from them, and GST does enable us to do that. So let's get to the big question, really. Why GST and not income taxes? Many people have said to us, and particularly to me, just put a penny on income tax. Well, first of all, you need to put a lot more than a penny on income tax to raise the sorts of revenues that we've been talking about here. And we've looked at all the various options, and it needs to be said right at the start, and this slide seeks to do it, that in terms of government revenues, Guernsey actually is very dependent on income tax. This slide shows that nearly 2/3 of our revenues comes from personal taxation or from social security contributions. In other words, we're very reliant on those in work. Now, if there's a downturn in the economy, if we have high unemployment, like I remember when I was a teenager in the early 80s, and you're too reliant on work, that causes all sorts of problems because revenues drop. It was interesting to note that even though unemployment went up in Jersey during the COVID crisis, actually their income from GST continued steadily. In fact, it increased for a while because people were spending more from capital. And there are quite a number of people who live off capital in our society, and this enables us to do it. In terms of taxes overall and government revenues, Guernsey has one of the lowest in Western countries of tax takes from our economy, from our GDP, if you like, our gross domestic product. We only take 22% currently, whereas I think somebody else referred to this, Jersey takes over a quarter, and places like the UK, 33% of government revenues, 33% of the GDP, and in France a whopping 45%. We're not suggesting those sorts of increases, but you can see how reliant we are on taxes on employment, and that's not good. And similarly, at the moment, the services that people want in Guernsey are equivalent, certainly, to those in Jersey and in the UK, but we're not bringing in the income that we need to. As I said before, if there's a downturn in our economy and if there's high unemployment, we would suffer currently. We do need to change this dependency. So GST allows us to, and this is something that was a bit of a revelation to me a few years ago, because I have consistently, I've been in the States since 2000, consistently voted against GST. And when they brought it in Jersey, I watched very closely how that was brought in. And one of the things that I didn't realize was that they bring in several millions from businesses, particularly from the finance sector, through an exemption charge, which is not a tax, but it's an income stream. And if we did the same thing, we would bring in 8 million, particularly from those, again, that have benefited from the changes in 010. And this is on top of the millions that were referred to before, that Deputy Mahoney referred to. And then I've mentioned tourists already, and that's another 6 million in this. This enables us, this is monies we wouldn't get if we taxed in other ways. This enables us particularly to help those on lower incomes. And because of that, we can then reduce income tax, as we're proposing, to 15% for those earning up to 30,000 a year. And it gives everyone also an allowance on social security contributions. The reform of social security contributions, which Peter will go into greater detail, again is helping those who would otherwise perhaps be more adversely affected by GST. And increasing personal income tax allowances. We're saying £600 extra as well. That's why we can put that slide up before that demonstrates that these proposals would mean that those up to and including those on median incomes would actually be better off, not worse off. So I was going to say some big buts, but that sounds a bit rude. But I'm sure you have some buts, because we've heard this as we've been discussing these proposals and already getting feedback from some people. But I'm not going to be able to answer all these questions, and we'll have a time for questions at the end. But let me just highlight a few of the key buts that you may have. First one is this: GST will create more inflation for 12 months. Yes, that's the answer. That's true. That's what happened in Jersey. But we factored this in. So we are going to adjust those who would be most adversely affected, particularly pensioners and those that are in receipt of benefits, to account for this even before GST is introduced. And of course, that inflation would only last really for a year because inflation is effectively measured in that annual rate. And then this is what happened in Jersey. It flattened out after that. So we have factored these sorts of things in. Second big but might be GST on its own is regressive. And we would agree, again, yes, on its own it is. And this is why many of us, and probably you, have been against it for so long. We are not suggesting GST as a silver bullet. We are putting in a package, a raft of measures. And this is why we can say that by doing this, we are able to raise sufficient revenues to be able to affect those for whom otherwise GST by itself would be regressive. So that those who perhaps would suffer the most are actually, in some cases, slightly better off than they otherwise would be. Next, big but might be it's difficult for businesses and encourages people to shop online. Again, this was something when you look into the detail in Jersey's experience and what we could do here that I wasn't aware of. And in Jersey, they exempted many small businesses from needing to be registered for GST. And here in Guernsey, we would be, and we're proposing, we would be able to exempt those small businesses with turnovers of under 300K. And that's quite a significant number of small businesses. There are many tradesmen and others in Guernsey who run small businesses who'd be worried about the administrative charges. Now, it doesn't mean some might choose to be registered for all sorts of reasons of their businesses. We're not saying they can't register, but they don't have to register. And that does make it less of an administrative burden, particularly for those. And we've set aside a budget in these proposals to help other businesses get on board so they understand what is necessary. What we're proposing in terms of GST is a broad-based, simple tax, not a complicated VAT as exists in the Isle of Man and in the UK. We're talking of broad-based, simple to operate that's appropriate for our size of population. And we also intend to make larger online retailers registered too, because that's what some people are saying. Now, of course, a few years ago, when Jersey introduced it, it was very difficult to do that. But Jersey's experience has been that they've been able to now, because it's much easier with the internet, to get on board those large retailers. I won't name any or advertise any tonight because I want everybody to buy local. But if people are doing that, they're now getting income and they're making them, if you like, administer it, which means that initially, when it was necessary in Jersey to employ loads more customs officers, they've been able to reduce that. So we are confident that we can do the same here and successfully involve those who would be purchasing online. And then a final question you might have in terms of the headline questions should food be exempt? Well, as I just said before, we are looking for something that is simple to operate and administer. As soon as you put food as exempt, it creates quite a lot of administrative headaches and it becomes quite complicated to operate. But also, analysis shows that actually it's the wealthier households who buy more food and would benefit more, because what you would be doing if food was exempt, you would exempt it for everyone, and so actually those who would benefit more are those who are spending more on food, are buying luxury food items and others. And really that's not what we want to do. It's better to help those who would suffer in that way by extra food costs in the way that we've suggested through the lower income tax rate and the benefit increases. So exempting food is less effective than supporting low-income households. And the ways in which we're suggesting we do this would mean actually that they are better off, have more to spend, even though a GST is brought in on food. If we did exempt food, we've worked out that we would have to raise GST, the level of GST, by at least 1% to compensate for what will be lost by food. So actually, you'd be benefiting those who are wealthier and spend more in supermarkets and on food generally, and you wouldn't actually benefit those who are less able to pay by doing that. That would be counterproductive. So the system we're suggesting is far less complex and far more cost effective than the sort of system that might exempt food like VAT in the UK or the Isle of Man. I'll hand over to Peter now.
And trusting me with the technology, that's always a mistake, but there we go. I'm not here to talk about tax. I'm here as President of the Social Security Authority to talk about the proposed changes to our system of Social Security. And it's been frustrating for me over the last year or so that that's really flown far too much under the radar. Because understandably all the focus has been on GST, on other possible tax changes, corporate tax. But actually in this package, one of the biggest and most notable things is an absolutely radical change to the way that we administer Social Security, and in particular to the contribution system. It really is a generational change. And it is also going to make the system far fairer, and it's also going to make it far more progressive. So when you think about the regressive nature of GST by itself and what we're doing to counterbalance that, yes, there's the 15% tax band, but that's small beer. Yes, there's a £600 increase in personal tax allowances, also small beer. What's doing the heavy lifting is going to be the radical reform of Social Security, and almost nobody's talking about it. Another general point, just before I come on to my first slide that I have to talk about, is what the states will be deciding in January will not be whether or not to raise many tens of millions of pounds from the Guernsey public. They've already decided that. They decided that last year because the Government Actuary Department told the states of Guernsey that if you don't do something, then your pension fund is going to run dry not too many years down the road. So you better do something. So the states did. They agreed a 10-year program of putting up Social Security contributions each and every year. The first increase came in January this year. The second increase will come in a few weeks' time. And unless we find another way of raising revenue, that will continue for another 8 years. So the decision in January, by the way, that will raise 36 million at 2021, in 2021 terms. So the decision in January is not whether to raise a whole lot more money from the public of Guernsey. That's already been decided and it's already happening. The question is how to raise it and what is the fairest way of doing that. And that brings me to the detailed slide on the Social Security system. Because even as President of Social Security, I have to admit that doing it with the Social Security structure at the moment isn't fair and it isn't progressive. And so I'd like to get away from the Plan A that the states have already agreed. Just talk about fairness, for instance. People, sometimes ask me, if my income is such, how much Social Security will I pay? I say, it depends, totally depends. Different people on exactly the same income pay wildly different amounts of Social Security. So just to take an example, you've got two, fairly well-to-do middle-aged people with £100,000 of unearned income coming in. One of them will pay Social Security on nearly all of that. The other one will go out. I would like not play the system because it's perfectly fair and it's a legitimate thing to do, but go out and get a little part-time job for £10,000 a year, and all they'll pay is on the earned income of £10,000. They'll pay not a penny on their unearned income. It's unfair, it's ludicrous. So we're going to cut through all of that, and all income will be treated the same, and everybody on the same income will pay the same amount of Social Security other than pensioners. Obviously, they will pay a far lower amount because they're no longer paying into the pension fund or to the unemployment fund, what's known as the Guernsey Insurance Fund. But with that wrinkle apart, all income will be treated the same and everybody will be treated equally. The other massive difference is that we will be bringing in personal allowances on the Social Security contribution system. There are none at the moment. There is what's called an income threshold, so if you earn less than, I forget the exact figure, but it's around about £8,000 a year, you pay no Social Security contributions. Incidentally, you don't get any credits towards your pension either. But the second you reach that threshold, it's not like income tax, where you've reached your allowance, you pay on everything above that. The second you reach that threshold, you pay on every single pound that you earn. So you reach a cliff edge, and so somebody on a really modest income is really clobbered by that, the fact that they're paying on absolutely all of their income. In future, the idea is to bring in a social security allowance, which will be parallel to the income tax allowance. So it will probably go up over the next few years, but if you took it now, it will be about 13,800 with the 600 added. And above that, yes, you will pay a slightly higher amount in social security contributions, but it takes quite a while above that threshold, that allowance, before you're actually not quite a lot better off than you would be at the moment. So lower earners, as the slide says, lower earners and up to middle earners are going to pay an awful lot less in contributions than they do at the moment. But it's absolutely true that higher earners will pay more. But it's also true that corporates will pay a lot more because they play the employer part of the contribution, and they will be paying significantly more than they do at the moment. So as John said before, when people say, well, why are you clobbering Guernsey people and not companies? We're not clobbering companies, but I think in quite a clever way, which is not anti-competitive, or will not drive companies away. We are actually making sure that they pay far more of their fair share. Now, I've seen a lot on the internet just today say, this is going to really hit people at the lowest. What about people on benefits? Will you really adjust it for all of these? We've already got a cost of living crisis, things going up. Will you really compensate for that and for GST? The answer is an unequivocal yes. Let's take, first of all, people on benefits, say income support. Already, the formula is to increase those benefits by RPIX. So even if we did nothing special, after a year's time, it would catch up with the inflationary impact of bringing in a GST. But we don't want to do that, because why leave people 1 year in arrears? So the idea is to increase the income support as well as the normal inflationary increase by 5% ahead of bringing in the GST, because everything in their basket basically will be GSTable. So it will leave them no worse off than they are at the moment. Likewise with pensioners, it probably won't be 5% because it will be tied to the actual inflation, and our best estimate is about 3.5%, 3.4%, a 5% GST would do, and that's because housing costs are not included in that basket. But again, we will bring that increase ahead of time. If we get it wrong, and it turns out to be a slightly higher or lower impact, then that will be adjusted at the end of the period. But we will make sure that we front load it. But I'm asked, what about people who aren't pensioners, and they're not on income support, they're just people on low incomes? We accept that. So any household on less than £28,000 a year, if they're not on income support and they're not pensioners, are going to be given several £100s. I think it's 450 for a single person, 680 or something for a married couple, simply to get to those hard-to-reach people who would otherwise be impacted. Yes, it's crude. It's what other places do as well, but we're absolutely determined that nobody in those lower sections should be worse off. And I have to say, in my time on the Working Party, my absolute credo has been, I will not support anything that is regressive. I will not support anything that doesn't actually protect people on more modest incomes. I'm now convinced, I don't want just the lesser of all evils, nobody wants to put up taxation, but I'm convinced that we've arrived at a package that does protect those people on low incomes. And just before handing back to Peter, I'd just like to say two things. I'm not close-minded. I've looked at this for 2 years. I can't find a better package in order to deliver the extra revenue we need while protecting lower earners. But if somebody between now and the end of January comes up with something that's not just a vague idea, but something that's costed and patently deliverable, I'm open-minded to that. What I'm not open-minded on is the fact that we do need to raise that extra revenue. If we don't, the cuts to public services are going to be shocking, absolutely shocking. When you get a chance to read the BA, focus in on section 3. That gives you some ideas of the kind of things that will happen if we don't actually raise extra government revenue and within the next few years. I hand back to Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I just develop that point before I move on to the last few slides that I've got to deal with. Nobody in the Working Party, I wasn't a member of the Working Party, but I was kept informed, and I agree with it entirely, would countenance any idea where those who are worse off in our society, those who are poorer, I should say, in our society are worse off. That just cannot happen. But against that, if there are any ideas, and we're not talking about fanciful ideas about suddenly discovering uranium in Torterville or whatever it may be, if there are some ideas, then we are open to consider them. This has been looked uphill, down dale, around every single corner. It is not something that we've come to with any degree of joy and jubilation. Now, what's going to happen next? Now, I've already touched upon this, and you probably know it anyway. This will be debated by the states of Guernsey, all 40 members of the states, in January 2023. Now, that will be a matter for the states. People can bring amendments. What I have said consistently to colleagues, and I repeat it now publicly, is that if any states member thinks he or she wants to bring an amendment or amendments, they should contact our officers. They've got all and every opportunity to ask any question they want, to get any information they want. But what we don't want is somebody on the day before the debate saying, I can suddenly cut costs by £150 million a year, and we don't need any of this, without any degree of certainty and any degree of detail. Magic doesn't exist in life. We've got to deal with the practical consequences of where we are. Now, if the states approve the recommendations, they would come into force in 2025 at the earliest. Now, we would ensure that the increase in benefits which Peter's dealt with was in force and people were receiving those before, for example, GST came into operation. Now, also, reference has been made to the various groups that we've met. I've met many groups. I'm going to be some more in the next few weeks, few days and few weeks. I met the retail and hospitality group recently. And one of those very sensibly said, well, what about if inflation is still at the level it is now in 2 or 3 years' time? Well, that's the last part of that slide. We would monitor wider economic and cost changes as part of the time frame. So if, for example, we don't expect it to be the case, but who knows, you know, the war in Ukraine could spread to the Baltic states or wherever it may be, something else could happen, we could have another pandemic, we hope none of those occur, then of course we would keep that under review. Now, again, Peter said that, and look at the policy letter. If these proposals are not accepted, then it's not a matter of perhaps we would have to make serious cuts to essential public services. We would have to make cuts to to essential public services. And there's this thing, it says it would mean reducing or closing down some services, for example. And I'm grateful to the cooperation we've had from principal committees. For example, Education, Sport and Culture, which is very well led anyway, said, look, we'd have to close a school, amongst other things, and we'd have to cut this service, and we'd have to cut that service. We'd have to close a library. Health and social care, amongst others, they'd have to reduce, if we had a 15% reduction, their costs by nearly £30 million, 29-point-something million pounds. How on earth are they going to do that? That would mean, just as a for example, we'd have to start charging for secondary health care, which we don't pay for at the moment. And people who are getting things currently get for free, well, they wouldn't be for free. They would have to be charged for in some way. So those are the stark and real consequences. This has been research, we've listened to what the public said, we've had drop-ins, we'll continue to discuss with people. Our door remains open between now and the debate. So the last note is, for more information, because the information will constantly be uploaded, go to ourfuture.gg/tax review. That is there for you to look at and consider, as well as the BA to which we have referred. That's the presentation. It's now your opportunity to ask questions. We're going to have another live review session where people who are live streaming, I should say, will have the opportunity to ask questions. For some reason they can't tonight. I apologise for that. So if you raise your hand, please, if you want to ask a question, and then somebody will come to you, then could you then say just your name? You don't have to give your surname unless you want to, and then ask your question. So, and I'll call. Now this gentleman, how long have you known me, Gordon?
Ever since you were born, Deputy Fairbrush. You was cheeky then and you're still cheeky now. But not so much cheeky, but a bit of a devil, I think. It must be the breed of you French. I'd like to ask a question, and perhaps Deputy Ruffy might be able to answer it more. It's regarding what he just said before he finished speaking about old age pensioners. And I'm an old age pensioner, but I might just mention to him, it's not his fault because he wasn't in the States at all then when this happened to me. But I had an injustice done. I won't specifically go into it. But I've been on a low pension because I've been punished by Social Security years ago. And it stopped me having a full pension. So now, even with the rents going up from, I've been notified by a housing association, our rents are going up so much in December, I think, the 1st. How can I pay extra rent when I'm not getting the full pension? My pension don't even cover me for my food alone.
Well, let me ask Deputy Ruffy that. I mean, I think it might go a bit beyond the tax review, but Peter, you may be able to assist.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is the right forum for dealing with individual situations, but I would say that anybody that's on a, well, whether or not they're on a reduced pension, if they're finding it difficult to make ends meet, the first thing to do is to check out whether they're eligible for income support, because that's the main safety net. And there are many pensioners who historically didn't pay all of the stamps at the time, as they were called, and therefore are on a reduced pension, and many of them are on income support. But Gordon, I hope you'll understand that this is not the time to deal. I don't know what calamity was done to you years back.
I know, excuse me. I know this is not the time, but we're here to ask questions.
Of course.
And it involves around us people that are here now,
Yeah.
and I'm one of them.
I think what we could say, Gordon, the general thrust of what we've said is that we want to ensure that the people who are in the lower earnings or on benefits are protected from these tax increases. You've seen the slide where that shows that is going to be the case, so that whatever changes the states make as a result of the decision in January will not impact adversely in relation to people on your kind of income. I think we need to pass on now to the next question.
Hello. Hi, Dan Ozier, Guernsey People Against GST. I'd like to quote your P&R lead, if I may. Calls for higher taxation can only drive us towards long-term decline. I believe if we start down this path to higher taxation, we will see business opportunity reduce and costs rise in all areas. Our young people, wealthy residents and businesses in all sectors will not stay in an island where there is no opportunity. History tells us that almost every jurisdiction, once a new tax is introduced, it never goes away. Once we put our taxes up, we would let that genie out of the bottle. What's your comment on that, Mr. Fairbush?
Well, I think, is that, you're quoting from Deputy Hellier, are you? Yeah, from his, well, Deputy Hellier, that was written 2 years or so ago. Deputy Hellier has been at the lead, one of the lead. He was on the working party with, amongst others, with Deputy Ruffy. And he's looked at all the facts. And as Winston Churchill once said, if you can't have your mind changed by the facts, you've got no mind to change. So in relation to that, Deputy Hellier has decided, with reluctance, because everyone on this panel is reluctant, all of us are reluctant, that we do have to make these proposals, put these proposals forward. And if we don't, there won't be the money to keep our schools open as they are, to keep our libraries open, to keep our health system. It isn't a matter of fancy things that we might want to do. It's a matter, basically, of life, death, and having decent services. My able colleague, Deputy Brouard, said recently in the States that what we've got first world Norwegian-type services with less than Norwegian-type taxes. That's what we've got, and we cannot continue to afford to pay them, to sustain them without paying for them.
Can I add a comment?
Please do.
I have to say that at the last election, I was quite frustrated because I was being very candid and telling everybody that I thought taxes would have to go up in the next term. I said not in the first year or so because we were trying to get over the effects of the COVID lockdowns, but I knew the taxes would have to go up. And it frustrated me that some people were, whether it was for votes or whether it was for genuine belief at the time, in denial of that fact. So to some extent, I would join in your criticism, but I draw a different conclusion to you. The reality is what the reality is, and the fact that some people were wrong 2 years ago shouldn't change the judgment of the states over what they have to do.
Yes, please do, John.
If I could just have one more follow-up question.
Please do.
I don't wish to take away from
Yep.
anywhere else. How can you expect the Guernsey public to pay more when you can't get your own costs under control? And I specifically refer to the civil service and the amounts that you are paying some people.
Well, I can comment on that as well, and just make the comments I was going to make before. I mean, I think what Deputy Mahoney referred to is we actually do have to do that. So it's not either or, it's both and. And in many cases, we have been kicking the can down the road for some time now on that. But that alone, those things you've mentioned, will not resolve these problems, because we're facing the same problems, demographic problems, costs of healthcare particularly, as all of our neighbours as well. And I see former deputies Honeybill and Doré in the room. They will remember back when we introduced 010 to the island, because we were on the Treasury team together in those days, that we were able not to do what Jersey did and bring in a GST. And I think it's quite remarkable that if these proposals are brought in, that we will have had over 15 years without the need to do that. But the point is, we cannot go on any longer. And I said at the time, I was not in favour of it, but I remember saying, it will need to come in because we are too dependent on taxing employment.
I just add to that as well. It's a very easy target to pick, the civil service, and we see a lot of it going on. But of the numbers, the increases that we've seen, a huge proportion of those are actually healthcare staff. So if the suggestion is...
The average wage in general is a lot higher than you find in retail and what I do.
Well, we have to start comparing apples and apples, right? If we're comparing a retail worker with a qualified accountant, then we're not playing the same game, are we? So we need to be very careful what we compare with what. But in terms of the numbers that are employed, if the suggestion is we stop bringing in nurses, then that clearly is not workable. If we need the nurses and the healthcare professionals, consultants, etc., we need them. We need to bring them in. Now, if that ups the number of civil servants or public sector workers, then so be it. In terms of the cost of them, I have those numbers, but actually when you look at them, and I have looked at them very closely, and now we do monitor all new employees over an SO1, which is about £50,000 a year. Now they have to go through a very stringent process before any get approved. And a deputy said to me just 2 weeks ago at a presentation, why am I seeing all of these damn adverts for civil servants in the paper? But of course, what we don't do is when someone leaves or retires or gets dismissed, we don't put an advert in saying John Smith has left and retired, and now we're replacing him with James Smith. So we need to be very, very careful about just picking on these numbers just on their own. These things need to be looked at in the round.
And can I just say, bear in mind the makeup of P&R, we are resolute in that we want to contain the civil service as best we can. There's none of us that... I mean, I've run businesses, I've been in partnerships, I've still got businesses now, and I don't want to increase staff costs beyond what they should be. So it's not a matter we've gone soft on it at all. Next, so thank you very much for your questions, by the way. They were very good questions. Thank you.
Mark Breton, as you know, I haven't trusted a lot of your decisions for a few years. You will have seen many emails from me over the pandemic and everything. The thing here with GST is that you're not giving any reassurances about the long term of it either. So you're saying 5% to bring it in, 15% income tax allowance in a new band, as if the tax office can cope with that. I'm still waiting for 3 tax returns, and I owe you money, so you need to look at that. But you're not going to actually be able to manage it, you know, with all of that. It's too complicated. The social security allowances, it's just a shambles. And then also, you're not giving me any reassurances that a year later it's not 8% GST, 10% GST, back to 20% income tax. It's so bloody obvious what you're planning. Like, you know, it's like, as you can tell, I'm shaking with rage because it's just so obvious what you're going to do over time. It's been done in Jersey. They started with a lower GST and then it went up. VAT in England, same. You know, it's just ludicrous, really. And the whole 15% thing is just a sweetener. But actually, in terms of ease, you would be better doing 20,000 before income tax and get thousands of people out of income tax altogether, because you've got another 11,000 that have been brought on by splitting the marriage income taxes. You're making it all too complicated, and then you're also just going to add to it over time, like you do with alcohol duty, fuel duty. Are those still going to be duties that you have, or are you removing them? No, you're not. So, you know, you're making it far too complicated, and there's a lot of stealth tax going on here. It's ridiculous.
I disagree that it's... It's certainly not stealth tax because it's open and obvious. And also, I can't commit to states in 7 or 8 years' time as to what they will do in relation to taxes. I can only say, you use Jersey as an example. Jersey started, I think, at 3.5%. They went up pretty quickly to 5%. They've been at 5% for a long time now. I'm not saying that they've, you know, I'm looking at them as any kind of parameter or any paradigm, but that's the position in relation to that. Now, the other taxes, there'll still be alcohol tax, there'll still be excise duty tax, there'll still be all the other taxes, TLP, etc., etc., etc. But to say that we're in some way trying to mislead the public, which is effectively what you said, is completely and absolutely wrong, and I take strong objection to it. I'm not here to mislead anybody. You can smile all you like. I'm not here to mislead anybody. I'm here to tell the truth to the potential taxpayers, both in this room and outside of this room. If it was possible to decrease tax or not increase tax, we would all do that. We'd all gladly do that. When we say in a few years' time, and I said it's not tomorrow or next year, but it's in a few years' time, that we don't have enough money to keep all our schools open, we don't have enough money to pay our carers, we don't have enough money to fund the nice drugs that I've mentioned earlier in the introduction, what are we going to do then? Where's that money going to come from? You could get a round of applause then. You won't get a round of applause then when people can't get the drugs they want, when their mother can't get the care that she needs, when their children or grandchildren can't go to school, to the school that they want to, when the teacher numbers have to increase, teacher pupil numbers have to increase. You won't get a round of applause then, and all the people that applauded then, I'd like them to tell me, because the door is open up until and including the debate, where they see that the money to fund these services will come from. Because if you can, I would gladly receive that information. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to add anything.
No, not really. Again, the idea that this is stealth when there are 4 of us sat here with a slide presentation and we've had, I don't know, half a dozen public drop-ins, it is quite frankly ridiculous to call this a stealth tax by stealth. I think it started at 3% in Jersey and they've had it at 5% for 8 years, I think, now. So I think those are the numbers. And I think it was you that gave me a leaflet on a piece of paper on the flyer on the way in, saying go here and you know, sign the petition, you know, no to GST and all the other bits. But perhaps on the bottom you also need a bit saying, and please add which hospital wing you will close, which school you will close, how many teachers you will dismiss, because that's the other option. If we do what is suggested and we just say there's no GST required, we don't need to do anything, head in the sand, then those things are going to happen. We've got to the end of the road and now something must happen. And I think you also noted, well, let's just put the income tax up. I think other increases. We've looked at those things and those things just don't come out in the way that we need to do them. It would need, I think John mentioned that people have said just put a penny on income tax and we'll be done. A penny doesn't cut it. A penny doesn't cut anywhere close to it. Now, in the market that we're in terms of the offshore jurisdiction with which we compete, if we suddenly say we are 25, 26, 27% as a basic rate of income tax, that affects our standing internationally in terms of our competitors. So then suddenly companies are not coming here, they're going to Jersey or the Isle of Man or the BVI. Now, those are real-world consequences, and as I said in my piece, the finance industry is what's paying all the bills, a majority of the bills, beg your pardon. So we have to be very careful about what we put in place and how that affects the finance industry.
We've looked at tax, putting up income tax. It's about, for every penny, it's about another 13 point something million income tax. And you'll see, and I appreciate that people have only just had the policy letter, and I'm not expecting people to be as familiar with it, of course, as we have been studying it. One of the scenarios is, you say, people on £60,000 per annum, which is about 20-odd thousand pounds more than the average or median wage. If they were taxed to bring in the amount of revenue that we need, they would pay income tax at 32.5% on their income. When you add Jersey's social insurance contributions, and Peter knows far more about this than I, so if I get it wrong, he will correct me, end at about £55,000, £56,000. Ours go up beyond that. So you'd additionally be paying in Guernsey to your 32.5%, if you're an employed person, another 6.8%. That means you'd effectively be paying tax. Remember the graph which showed that 63% of tax comes from income tax or social security. You'd effectively be paying tax at nearly 40% in the pound. If you're a self-employed person, and we've got lots of self-employed people in Guernsey, your tax rate, your social security rate's over 11%. So you'd be paying tax at over 43%. If you said, well, forget that, just take the very rich, those earning £100,000 or more, you'd be taxing them at something like 50, 60, 70%. Now, if you think they're going to stay at 50, 60, 70%, you're dreaming. So I'm quite happy to accept your petition, but please add to it how you say we're going to bridge that gap.
Well, thank you
very much. Good. Another question, but thank you very much. Again, I'm grateful for that. That's the kind of contribution that's helpful because we need to know what people are thinking and saying. So thank you very much for that. Yep, gentleman here, sorry. With his hand. Oh, sorry, I missed you there. Apologies. Yes, sir. Sorry, apologies. Yeah, I missed you. Go. Ask your question.
I would have preferred us to have introduced, similar to the UK, with a graduated by 4 different sectors of tax, aren't there? I'm assuming you all looked at that and decided because Jersey haven't done it and because of competition that you decided against introducing such a system. The other thing I want to say, just make a few quick comments. You've recently, and I'm not a misogynist at all by any means, I had 4 daughters and 4 sons, but you've just changed the system of taxation for women and you've introduced an extra 10,000, I think, if you like, jobs or papers to do per annum because of that decision. Am I right in saying that?
You say?
Extra income
for separate taxation for women.
Tax returns, I think you mean.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're giving more work to the tax authority, and the gentleman there who I don't know, I'm also waiting for the last 2 years' returns. I'm not particularly worried about that.
You shouldn't be waiting, none of you.
Because you've basically got my money before, and I'm hoping I'll have a very tiny bill at the end of it. But this is going to give more work to the income tax authority. I can understand why it's been done, but are you going to have to introduce additional civil servants to cover this extra work?
I think the answer to that is yes, there'll be a few more. You're right. But what we had a few months ago, 7, 8 months ago, I can't remember exactly when, but certainly during the currency of this year, is we had the 2 civil servants from Jersey, civil servants rather than politicians, so we would get the facts rather than the political bent, come over who were running GST in Jersey. I think they've got a staff of 3 or 4 or 5, not very many. The cost of administering the state's cost, of course, there's a cost to business, nobody pretends otherwise. And you're aware that in our proposals, we're saying that it should be £1 million spent to help businesses set up their administration of the GST. The cost of running GST 2 years ago in Jersey, so it is 2 years out of date to be fair, was £800,000 per annum. And it was bringing them in 2 years ago, I think it was 94 million. The figures that we've just received for this year is that their GST return will be over 100 million. Now, I imagine the 800 has gone up because, as I say, that was a figure a couple of years ago. So, yes, that has been factored in into the cost analysis.
The other thing, can I also mention, is that an excellent 2-parter has just been on television. Unfortunately, I'm pleased I watched it. Brian Cox, the actor, made a comparison between the have and the have-nots in the UK, and he went to the United States, as you know, if you watched it. I forget his name, but the billionaire who sold the telco company invited Brian Cox into his fabulous home in London.
Oh, yeah. I know. It's John something or other. Yep.
Yeah, he spent 70 or 90 millions on renovating.
Yep.
He also was asked a question, and he said, if you remember his answer, he feels that he and the wealthy should pay more tax. We have quite a number of incomers here who are very wealthy. It's fantastic that we've attracted them here. There's going to be a super home at the old Idle Rocks, which will cost multi-millions. This is why I preferred a graduated similar to the UK system, whereby the more wealthy would pay more. If that gentleman in London was prepared to offer and say he's prepared to pay more taxes, why aren't the wealthy incomers prepared to do the same for us?
John?
I'd like to answer that because our proposals go a good way towards that. And that is that particular individual in London, if he'd spent multi-millions on his house, and we do have some that do that in Guernsey, he will have paid VAT on all of those things. He will have paid VAT. And we currently have people spending money, buying new cars every 3 years, and having going out for expensive meals and that sort of thing, who currently do not pay on the huge consumption that they spend here in Guernsey. So our proposals include that. As a result of that, it is certainly simpler. I know you're referring to things like capital taxes and others, but it's certainly this system does, and we've tested it out, it does mean that those who are spending more do pay more into our system. That's why I believe it's the best way forward.
Can I just add to that? There are, and it's, again, I'm not accusing them because they are perfectly legitimately using the system as it is, but there are quite a lot of people in Guernsey with significant wealth, but very little in the way of income, and actually draw down on capital on a regular basis. They, because all of our income, our taxes are focused on income, are actually, despite being very wealthy and using the services of Guernsey, paying very little towards them. And I think that's something that we do need to address. And if we only have income-related taxes and charges, we won't manage to do that.
Just your point. Your good point about, I think it's Caldwell, I can't remember that chap. Yeah. Anyway, he spent between 70 and 100 million pounds. That means he'd have paid VAT of between 14 and 20 million pounds. If he was doing that in Guernsey, we would not get a penny.
He decided to stay in the UK. Just out of interest, I've just had a message from my eldest daughter who's lived in the UK for many, many years. She's a chartered accountant but has her own business now. Her energy bill has just risen by 233%.
In England? Yeah. Well, aren't we lucky? It hasn't risen by 233% here. Right, next question, please. Oh, sorry, yes?
I think I'm right in saying that this isn't the first time that Guernsey has actually introduced a form of sales tax. It was introduced around about 1947 or 48 to pay for the reparations for the infrastructure after the occupation.
Yep.
And then it was done away with towards the end of the 1950s when things got back on an even keel. Now, I'd like to think that although I'm against the whole idea of GST, because I think it is grossly inflationary, but if you were to introduce this and get it past your state's members, I am concerned that it's an easy way of raising money to go and spend it on other projects. Now, there's many examples where the states have actually spent money on projects which have been a total waste of time.
Yep.
How many pieces of legislation have gone through the law offices to produce stuff which is sitting there on shelves and never been used? And I suspect, Peter, that you could probably vouch for that.
Yes, I can, Nick. You're right.
I am concerned that if you introduce this, will you have you may not be around
no.
to decide when Guernsey's got back on an even keel, that it would be disbanded. And therefore, it will just become, as our colleague down here in the front, another form of taxation. And I think you'll be driving away the younger ones who we're relying on to pay for my drugs as an OAP for the future.
No.
So it's a very retrograde step, I think.
Let me just explain. I think you've made a very good point about the... And again, what Guernsey used to have till the early 60s was a surtax, because tax used to be in Guernsey, I think it was something like, going back to the old pounds and pence, pounds, shillings and pence, something like 5 and 3 in the pound. And what they did, they decided in the early 60s to equalise it in the 3 crown dependencies at 4 shillings in the pound or 20 pence, and it's been at that rate for the last 60 years or thereabouts. But I can't guarantee that in 10 years' time, somebody wouldn't say, we'll put it up from 5% to 7% or whatever it may be. What has been lacking for many, many states' assemblies now is discipline on the part of states members. The hand goes up, we'll just approve this expenditure. It's only another 200,000. I've heard them say only another 200,000. Most of them wouldn't have earned £200,000 in their lives over the many years. Just another 200,000, just another 500,000, just another 3 or 4 civil servants. We've got to move away from that. But what we're now talking about is paying the basic bills for health and education and stuff like that. Now, I can't guarantee anything. I don't know what's going to happen in January. The states may decide that they're not going to approve this package, or an amended package like this, whatever it may be. If so, then you talk about young people, old people, all people will not have the services going forward that they have got now. And I'm not talking about the fripperies that could be done away with. I'm talking about basic services like health and education. That is the test. If people don't want to hear that message, then that's down to them. But in 5 or 10 years' time, when hospitals or bits of hospital are closed, schools, you've got, when I went to Amherst School, we were over 40 kids a class. Over 40 kids a class. From the time I started at Vauxhall Infants to the time I went to Elizabeth College, I was never in a class of less than 40 kids. Do we want to go back to that? Do we want to go back to that, where I think there's 20 odd in a class now? Do we want to go back to when I was a kid, the only time that I went to the doctor, because my mum used to have to pay for it, my father broke his back in 2 accidents, was when we were almost, I'm exaggerating a little bit, when we had pneumonia. As kids, we could manage to catch pneumonia, so we had to go to the doctor then, because otherwise we would die. Do we want to go back to that kind of society? If we do, then we can be in a position whereby we run out of money. But we want to provide people with decent services, not the fripperies, not the benevolence. There are people here in this room, politicians in this room, who put their hand up to everything. They'll vote for every kind of expense because it's just put the tax up, make people pay. And yet when it comes to difficult decisions, they'll shrink away from that and say, no, you can't do this. I'm not here to shrink away from these decisions. I wish I didn't have to sit here and tell you intelligent people in this room and the intelligent people listening on the internet that this is where we are. If you don't want to accept it, and if people want to give another round of applause when they say we don't want GST, let them do it. But then when they're in 5 or 10 years' time when the bills can't be paid, perhaps they'll reflect that they weren't so wise to clap hands at Beaucamp Hall 10 years ago.
Can I just add to that and agree with everything that Peter has said? I think you raise a very good point. And it's foolish for us to try and make promises for future states' assemblies to do, but it's why we do need an engaged electorate, and glad to see you here tonight. But we also need an electorate that realises that these things are not easy to do. I'm glad there's an experience from Guernsey's past where they did have to put taxes up because it was a crisis situation. My parents lived here after the war. I didn't come along until 1964, but nevertheless, I knew a bit about that. And then obviously we've seen that go. Now there's no reason why taxes can't come down. We're suggesting income tax should come down for those earning less than 30,000 a year. VAT has come down in the UK over time. It's gone up again afterwards, but taxes do go up and down. The thing is, we can't presume what the future holds. All we can say is this is what it looks like from our perspective. And from my perspective, we, and I include myself in that because I've been involved in it, have kicked the can down the road too many times. We now need to act on this if we're going to continue to have the public services that people are demanding. Because one of the problems is we make decisions in isolation. We look at that and we say, oh, the UK's got nice drugs, we should have them too, without actually thinking, and I've said this quite a lot recently, so forgive me, but my parents taught me that we couldn't have everything. If you lived on a rock in the middle of the channel, you couldn't have all the things that you'd have in a large jurisdiction like the UK. But you enjoyed the things that we do have here, which sometimes money can't buy. But nevertheless, today, we are living in an age, I find, in a culture where people want the same services as elsewhere, but they only want to pay 1980 costs for them. And we can't live like that.
Can I take very briefly a slightly different tack to that? You were talking about your worry about driving out younger working people. Take you back to what I said at the beginning. If we don't bring in a new tax package of some sort, whether it's this one or another one, then what's going on for the next 9 years is increases in the social security contribution rates on the working population. That's what will drive young people away, because it's loading all of the burden just on the working population. It's all tax on wages. What we need is a broader-based tax package where everybody takes a little bit of the load, in particular those people who've got the broader shoulders, because otherwise your modestly paid people will be seeing for the next 9 years, every year, an extra 0.1% on their social security contributions.
Can I just add one final thing as well? It's really, actually, I'm really pleased to hear someone else say that they're fed up of all these fanciful projects and wastes of money. And indeed, one of the first things that this PNR did when it came in was to look at the number of extant resolutions that the states had of things that we need to do. And yet some of them were 4 and 5 years old. So you really didn't need to do them that much, did we? And in fact, one of the first things that the Assembly did pretty early on was, I think there are hundreds of extant resolutions that just got binned on the basis that if we hadn't done them in 2 or 3 years, we really didn't need to do that. And whilst the government work plan was forceful in was great, I think it did a good job. The second iteration of it was perhaps a bit better, but could have been even better still. And the third version, we can guarantee, will be much reduced. And as I mentioned earlier, Deputy Murray sat there, now has the unenviable task of doing that. So I agree entirely, and a lot of deputies agree with you that too many things trying to be done all at the same time. All of those resolutions, hundreds of resolutions that we had, all took up officer time, they took up law officer time, and they were all binned. So all of that work was entirely useless and wasted, and we've got to stop doing that. We agree entirely.
Nick, who are we? Yep.
Firstly, good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for this engagement. We're always pleased to have you engage with the public and for the drop-ins likewise. I'd like to start by welcoming the proposed reforms to social security. They seem entirely positive as far as I'm concerned. Let me move on now to the rest of the package, and I accept that it's part of a package. One of the themes that's emerging this evening is that the people with the broader shoulders should bear more of the cost. But I think for those who don't have broad shoulders, the message that's coming across from the States at the moment, at least, is to change an old advert slightly. You know, the PNR message seems to be, if you'd like less chocolate on your biscuit, join our club. But at the moment, as I see it, if you had thought of diversifying the tax structure, not just on the first leg, which is normally income, or just the second leg, which is normally consumption, have you also given thought to the third leg, which is that of assets? Countries such as Switzerland, which have significant financial services sectors themselves, have asset-based taxes. They don't appear to be losing large numbers of people. Their financial services sectors don't appear to be deserting them, and they're still getting quite good quality chocolate as well. So although I haven't been able to read the background papers, because sadly the website, the state's website, was not quite worth its value for money today, I would like to know, have you looked into the possibility of asset-based tax, thereby, remember, further broadening the tax base and ensuring that those who can afford to pay probably will?
You're talking about a wealth tax here?
Asset-based taxes are not necessarily wealth taxes.
That's a wealth tax, really.
So I assume you'd know more about this than I would. But my question effectively is, have you looked into it?
Yeah, we have. But Peter?
You'll have noticed that the biggest asset most people have in Guernsey is their home. And you'll notice that GST has gone up really quite significantly over recent, sorry, not GST, TRP have gone up fairly significantly over recent years. I think there's a limit how far you can take that, because there are people living in family homes that are actually on quite low incomes but have got quite a valuable asset. Now, you could say, well, they should be forced to sell it. They don't need it. But I think there's emotional investment in something like a family home, which I would not want to get to a point where I'm trying to lever people out. If you're talking about other assets, then I am really torn, because philosophically I don't have an issue with that. But I do think there is Switzerland is Switzerland. I do think we have a competitiveness issue with other offshore finance centres, and I can't cut off the island's nose to spite its face. So I don't have a philosophical objection to it, but I think there is a practical and competitive issue around it. It's the kind of idea some people may well put forward. We're expecting a number of amendments probably suggesting different things. So that's one that might come out of the woodwork between now and the end of January.
Are there figures that go with the work you've done on wealth taxes, asset taxes?
Well, E&Y did the exercise, as I mentioned earlier, which took them 3 months to do. So they looked at everything from capital taxes to inheritance taxes to wealth taxes.
That will be in the VA when it actually...
No, that detail, there are certain, in fact, the E&Y report is about 45 pages, I think, in there. From memory, I can't remember exactly what's in there, but it's 45 pages of very detailed, the art of the possible and the impossible.
I mean, what we've got to factor in as well, and I'm a person, I'm a person who's never inherited anything, never would inherit anything, so I don't have a problem with people that do inherit things. There are some members of the states who've inherited quite a lot, but are quite left-wing, and they've nothing to stop them signing over their inheritance to the tax, to the good people of Guernsey, but I don't see any of them rushing and doing that at the moment. But they can do it tomorrow. I would sign over any inheritance I've got, but that would be very easy because I haven't had any, and I'm not going to have any. But in relation to that, if we do that, the finance sector will go. We may think we're really being Puritan, we're doing really good stuff. The finance sector will go. The rich people will go. And now, in an ideal world, everybody would pay all the tax that they should pay wherever they live. That's not the way it works in the real world. So I've got no empathy towards people who've got lots of assets not paying their full rate of tax. What I've got is the realism that if we do that, we may feel puritanical and aesthetically pure. I've used that, that's bad grammar, but you know what I mean by that. But we would have people in Guernsey would be a heck of a lot poorer. So that would be the reality of it. Yeah.
So I'd like to come back. You have chosen to interpret that very narrowly, and I apologise if that was a consequence of my poorly worded question. But there are people with multiple homes. There are people with land with planning permission that are sitting on just doing nothing. There are all sorts of other assets that I assume had been considered. And I'm not suggesting this replace everything else. Not at all. I accept your argument that we need more money, that we need to pay for the services. I entirely accept that. I'm saying that as part of that cocktail, as part of that package, you consider a broader element. So we're not saying every family must lose their home. Please don't interpret it like that. Think of it more positively.
No, people weren't saying that. I don't think most people's biggest asset, most people, I appreciate the point you make, there are some people with lots of houses and lots of assets. Most people's biggest asset is their house. But there are people, of course there are people that have got multiple assets, millions of pounds in the bank, shares, and own 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 properties. And they could be taxed. We could have effectively a wealth tax. We could do that. That would be, we could bring that in. We would gain money for a year or two and we would lose money in the long term. If I thought it was achievable, I would be in favour of it. It isn't achievable.
My question is...
Where am I looking at? Sorry.
Me, over here.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Apologies. I was looking that way. My apologies.
You talk about GST being 5%. How much of that percentage will go on the administration of that?
About 1%. Not 1% of the... That doesn't mean 20%, i.e. 1%. It means 1% of what you will raise will go out in paying for the administration.
I mean, if I can say it, the figures that we've looked at, and particularly on Jersey's experience, I used to work, my first job was working for VAT in the UK, and that put me off any consumption tax of that sort. Is very complicated, and nothing like Dennis Healy said, it would be self-policing. It was a load of rubbish. However, Jersey's experience is very different because we're living in a different age, and they have a broad-based GST. And as I said before, their costs have been far lower than I expected, and they've been able to reduce even since then because of the online nature and the digital nature of them able to do it, because it's a simple tax. So actually far less.
In Jersey, though, didn't they start at 3% and they had to raise it by 2% because they weren't making any money?
I don't think that was... Sorry.
They certainly started at 3% and put it up at 5%. A cynic might have thought they were always going for 5% and were trying to get a foot in the door. It wasn't because they weren't making any money, but they weren't making enough money. But it wasn't the fact the administration was too big a percentage of it. It's just that their books weren't balancing, and they put it up from 3% to 5% to raise extra revenue. To be fair to them, that was quite a long time ago now, and when it moved to 5%.
I think it was 8 years ago that they changed it.
Yeah, so they're not constantly ratcheting it up, but you're quite right. It brought in at 3% and went to 5%.
Will there also be an additional cost for the Social Security Administration, or is that with the people already there?
It won't. I don't see why it should cost us any more at all. The computer programs need to be changed to factor in different allowances to the ones we have at the moment. But I have to say we're an incredibly efficient department. For instance, the whole pension scheme, and pensions are probably the biggest expenditure we have and cover God knows how many tens of thousands of people in Guernsey. 2 people do that part of their time and do other things the rest of their day. So it's not a big burden as far as human resources is concerned.
One of my main concerns is the fact that you put tax on petrol, and that's gone up and up and up over the years, but the money doesn't seem to go on the roads, or what our motor tax used to go on.
It was never intended to go on the roads. We haven't had a road tax in my lifetime. I don't know if we ever did. People get confused, and people used to call it the road tax. It was a motor tax. It was just a general tax-raising measure, any more than the tax on tobacco is all spent on tobacco-related healthcare. Yes, people draw parallels, but it was always a general tax. But you hit on a very good point. When we got rid of motor tax and put it all on petrol, it was a narrowing of our tax base. And to that extent, it was a mistake because it made us more exposed and fragile. And what's happened, of course, since is that internal combustion engines become far more efficient, so people use far less petrol than they used to do. Electric cars will come along as well. So, the fact that we narrowed it down and said, let's do it all on petrol, in retrospect, was a mistake. And I have to say I voted against it at the time because it was a narrowing of our tax base.
Sorry, one more final question, please. If you're going to bring in GST, could you make healthy food exempt? Obviously, if you don't put a GST on sugary foods and basically take the GST off fresh fruit, low salt food and things like that, then you're actually increasing people's health. So hopefully they won't have to use the service at the hospital.
I can hear all the legal debate over what's healthy food and what's not healthy food. I mean, in the UK, there was a classic Jaffa cake. The High Court had to decide whether a Jaffa cake was a cake or a biscuit, because biscuits didn't have VAT on them and cakes did. And they decided the Jaffa cake was definitely a cake because it started off soft and went hard, whereas biscuits start off hard and went soft. And if you went something, we're going to exempt healthy food, I think the 4 of us on the panel here, I don't think eating meat is healthy. They will totally disagree with me. So, I mean, I don't know where we would go with that. But it comes back to your first question about how expensive is it to administer. If you keep it simple, New Zealand model, the administration costs are incredibly low. As soon as you complicate it, those ratchet up very, very quickly.
Jersey recently just had a debate, actually, and I didn't refer to it before, but where an amendment was laid, effectively to exempt food. It wasn't just healthy food, but and it was quite quite extensively defeated. And that is because in small jurisdictions, it's very much not cost effective to do those sorts of things. It's just too complicated to do. But I think your intentions are absolutely right. Maybe there's other ways of dealing with that by putting a tax on sugary foods and that. But I see Deputy Gollop is here, and he's normally against that sort of thing.
Can I just say to everybody, it's really important that we use the microphone because the vast majority of the audience is not here. They're online and they won't hear if you haven't got the microphone.
Deputy Fairbrushe, you briefly mentioned about tax reliefs and stuff like this, as in on mortgage relief.
Yep.
Now, I know you've kept it in for next year. Are you intending to still do away with it? Because if you are, we have enough trouble in keeping our younger generation in Guernsey. It makes it very difficult for people to purchase houses. We don't tend, let's be honest, to do a lot for our younger generation in the fact of helping them to stay in Guernsey.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of them, I know my brother-in-law, for instance, as it stands at the moment, he's off in uni. I don't think he'll be back. A lot of my younger colleagues in the trade, they've left the island as well. So if we take away mortgage relief as well, how are they supposed to afford to buy a house?
I agree with you entirely. We got young people. You've mentioned a couple of examples, a lot more leaving, and we want those people to stay. I mean, sometimes people go away for a few years and come back. We know that, and they bring their life experience back. But I know the point. I agree with the point you're making. What we did this year was stop. We put in aspic the taking away the mortgage relief. We deferred it for another year. I can't guarantee what the states will do next year, but I can say I think that's a sensible thing, i.e. to keep it. I hope I'm agreeing with you. You understand what I mean by that. But there's a wider problem, isn't there? We've got housing, whether you rent it or buy it in Guernsey, is ridiculously expensive. It's 16 or 17 times the average income to buy an average house. And now that's ridiculous. So we've got to attack that problem. That's perhaps beyond today, but the point you make is a really good one. We've got to make sure that young people can have reasonable accommodation. What about?
Mark Dorry. Budgetary pressures, GST and offsetting with adjustments to tax and benefits was debated and rejected by the last states but one. So it was a known issue at the last election, and almost all successful candidates said they were opposed to GST. On the election 2020 website, the following question was asked: what is your opinion on introducing goods and sales tax? Deputy Fairbrushe answered, in principle, against it. Deputy Hellier said, against it as it harms the poorest in society. Deputy Latoc said, I used to work for VAT in the UK and have seen firsthand how regressive and expensive to implement and oversee such taxes can be. So I wish to avoid introducing a GST unless absolutely unavoidable. Deputy Mahoney, I'm against GST and will not support. Deputy Murray, no, not at all. Deputy Roffey, I'm against it. It would be regressive. GST is a fundamental issue. How can the public have any confidence in our electoral system and electoral pledges if the states now support GST?
Yeah, I'll start on that because I do think we're in a situation where it is now unavoidable, but also because we're not just suggesting GST. If that was the case, and I perhaps didn't emphasize that enough when I spoke, if that was the case, then all of the things you said, and I'm sure all my colleagues would not be here tonight trying to persuade you to agree with us. What we have been persuaded is that a raft of packages, which includes a GST, but deals with the regressive nature of what a GST by itself will be, is appropriate. In fact, as I said, I think it's unavoidable now. We need to bite that bullet.
Yeah.
I think my quote went on. Oh, sorry, Peter. No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You carry on.
No, that's right. As I said earlier, I was very candid with people at the last election that I thought taxes were going to have to go up. But you're absolutely right when asked specifically about GST. I said, and I've been saying for the last 20 years, I think, that I do not favour this because basically, people on lower incomes have to spend all of their income on goods and services. People on higher incomes don't have to pay all of it, and therefore a GST is regressive. And that's what I said in that answer. I didn't like it because of the regressive nature. I have to say that, certainly on the Tax Working Party, I have seen, as Jonathan has said, a way that you can construct a package which does contain a regressive GST, but as the slide behind me shows very clearly, the overall package is progressive rather than regressive. So, to some extent, you're right. I apologise that the very specific answer I gave there, you could say that I'm now moving away from, but I was very clear about why I was against GST. It was because it was regressive. What is now being put forward as a package is absolutely the opposite.
I think, Mark, it shows, I think I said in principle, what I said in 2016 is I was absolutely against it. So if you look back 4 more years, you'd say I definitely said no. But I sort of softened my position a bit in 2020. In principle, I'm against it. In principle, I don't like it. But you've got to have regard to the reality of where we are. Not one of the 4 of us, not one of the 5 of us, if you include Bob, who's sitting in the front row, would really think yabba dabba do. This is what we would need to do. But what we've got to have regard to is the reality of the situation. And I think if people say, OK, the next election, if any of us stand, I'm not going to vote for you because you voted for GST, well, that's democracy. They'll be able to do that in relation to where we are. But when I say I don't care about that, of course I care about it. But more importantly, it's trying to do the right thing. And I don't regret doing what I regard as the right thing.
I think I feel obviously speak as well about it. I've already apologised in a previous state's debate for a change of position. But what's just been read out there is half a story. Because, of course, what we're saying is, GST, by its very nature, is regressive. Nobody doubts that. And as Peter has already referenced, the graph sat behind us at the moment shows us it isn't. So if the question had been, if someone could introduce a progressive type of GST, would you be in favour of it? Then I suspect you'd have got a whole different bunch of answers. But that wasn't the question that was asked. It's GST, period. So does someone, and GST on its own, period, is regressive. So does anyone that stood for election in 2020 was going to say, yeah, to hell with it, let's have a regressive GST? No, of course not. So we have to be careful that we're telling a full story here. The stuff that's on the screen in front of you at the moment is not a regressive tax. It's progressive. All the red lines there, the red bars there, are clearly showing that some people up to 3% in the top 5th percentile there. So I think we have to be very careful about the story, about promises in manifestos, and that we're actually quoting the correct answers here. Sorry, with the microphone.
The budgetary pressures were known at the last election. It was well known. It had been first proposed in 2015. So this was an ongoing situation that everybody knew, and everybody, and including all those on the bench who are existing states members, they knew the situation, and anybody who was standing should have understood the situation. And I don't think it's right to say things have changed. I apologise, because you stood on that basis.
But things have changed.
That's absolutely right. And that's why, because I did know the situation, I said that taxes would have to go up in this term. I do agree that I said that I didn't favour GST because it was regressive. And I went onto the tax strategy working party still with that attitude. And I've tried to find better alternatives. And I've tried to make sure that if it does have to go ahead, it's ameliorated so that it, not just ameliorated, but actually turned around into a progressive system. I said what I genuinely believed at the time. I wasn't trying to pull wool over anybody's eyes. I believed it. I cannot now find a package that doesn't include it that's going to address the funding needs of our vital services. I'm open-minded. If by the end of, I've said at the beginning, if by the end of January somebody comes forward with a way it will fill that funding gap that does not include the GST, which is clearly robust and sustainable, not just a vague idea, why don't we go and explore this, then I'll be the first to say hurrah, because I really don't like the idea of GST, but I was telling the truth as I saw it at the time.
I think it's important to note that the tax review committee or working group, whatever you want to call it, was myself, Deputy Hellier and Deputy Roffey, all GST sceptics, and Mark Thompson, beg your pardon, a non-states member, and all of us GST sceptics. So the evidence that we've actually got to the point where all of us now believe that this is the only thing you can do really should tell a story.
But again, building on that point, the questioner there, if people believe that there should be, I'm calling it a wealth tax, you can call it whatever you like, asset tax, wealth tax, or if the income tax ought to be, as that gentleman said, progressive, or etc., let states members bring that before the states in January, and we can debate it. Let states members do that, and then the states will debate it, and they'll decide which is appropriate. This is what we're proposing. We can't stop, and wouldn't want to stop, other states members bringing forward what they think is the right thing. But what I would ask them to do is to research it, not turn up the day before or 7 or 8 days before with an amendment which says cut costs by 60% on such and such without any idea as to how that's going to be, because that's just irresponsible government.
Sorry. Thank you for your time. The first thing, if I may ask, is what I didn't like about your presentation. It says on businesses we have the potential to raise, say, 27 million. Now, the thing is potential, and we aim at household 23 million. Surely by now you should know exactly what you're going to get, because in other words, you could be saying it's 27 million. And then by the time you've done your things with the businesses, it may be 20 million. That's the first question. And when are there should be something from your whatever you call it, what you've done for us, saying assurances on that you won't go over 1% on running the GST. Because what it does there is you in the states and deputies that nobody can make amendments and get somebody, a consultant, to spend £500,000. You should be giving assurances to the public and to the constituents of Guernsey what you're going to do and what you're going to promise, because otherwise you need to try and develop trust. And the reason why I clapped before, I totally agree with you, you've got to raise the money. So I probably would be in favour of GST, I understand the situation, but there are so many other things that need to be changed as well. Can you put assurances to the public to show that part of deputies and part of those working on the committees, because you don't have accountability, which is lacking in all the deputies, you need to have assurance and then develop trust between both parties and the public. So why can't your what you're displaying there change that and give assurance? Because then people will know what it's going to be.
Yep. It's the best, I think, with any tax, or you could say it's the best estimate. You can't say it'll be 26,936,000. You know what I mean? You just can't do that. What you're entitled as a member of the public is to say, this has been assessed, and that's the best figure that can realistically be achieved. But it can't give an absolute guarantee. I think your other point too about, I can't sit here and say that in 5 or 6 or 7 years' time, the states might not decide to put up GST to 7% or whatever it may be. I can't give you that guarantee because A, that's not within my remit, and B, that's not the way it works. The next states can make whatever decision it deems to make. But I think what the points you've raised are good ones, in that the public are entitled to an assurance that this is the best that we can do at the moment for the foreseeable future. Because this tax, even if it is, and we're talking about GST, even if it's approved by the states in January, it's going to be another 2 and a bit years before it comes in. And one of the slides, I remember on the slide, I think it was one of the last slides, about macroeconomic changes. If things change, then it can be adjusted. I mean, if, for example, let's say we've got 15% inflation, let's hope we don't, by the way, in 2 or 3 years' time, it would be silly to bring in an inflationary tax because you're adding inflation to high inflation. So we'd have to defer it. But that would only be, kicking the can a bit further down the road, and we haven't got a lot of road left. But I think your points are very good ones. Thank you for raising them.
predominantly the states have always been poor at doing things, or they've been progressively very expensive, and they don't act in time for businesses as normal businesses were wrong, and very not cost effective. So therefore you need to, if you're selling this, you need to say to people, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to do in respect of overspends, or somebody deciding we want to spend £1 million on a consultant doing something on waste.
Yeah. I'd just like to add to that. I think it's a really excellent point. And the officers, at my request, have now finally given me a list of all consultants that we employ, the basis of those contracts, how much they're being paid, what notice periods, etc. they're on. Likewise, that's consultants and contract staff. So they are being looked through right now with is this the right person, or can I actually employ another person on full-time and pay half the money effectively. So it's an excellent point, and that work is being done right now.
Thank you very much for a very clear and interesting presentation. I realise that in the conversation we've had over the last few minutes, we've been focusing on just one element, which is GST, and I accept that it's important to see that as just one element of a very complex programme which you're proposing. But if I may just keep on GST for a moment, two questions. I haven't had a chance to read the policy letter yet, but am I right in assuming that the GST is going to be about as simple as you can make it? In other words, that, for example, businesses will not be able to seek rebates on GST as businesses can in the UK, which means that individuals pay a lot of VAT, but businesses are able to reclaim it. And secondly, how do you deal with the large number of people, and I plead guilty, who may find themselves ordering things from companies based somewhere in that big island on the other side of the English Channel, and are able to purchase things without paying VAT? How do you square that particular circle?
Well, if I can start with the latter one, Tim, I think and forgive me if I didn't emphasise it, we recognise that people, and it's mainly one or two large international online businesses that purchase things in that way, and people have done that, and that's been Jersey's. The Jersey's had to face that for well over a decade now in that, and they have managed to do that and have agreements with them, and over 95% come from those particular companies that people order from, and we would be able to do the same. So you recoup from that, and they pay at the time at which they buy them. And it's been quite impressive to see that brought in. That wasn't the case when Jersey introduced it, and therefore it took a lot more policing and enforcing. And your first point was, I can't remember now.
Simplicity.
The simplicity, yes. It is. Yes, VAT was very complicated, part of because it did have different rates to begin with, and there were exemption things, and then there were all sorts of the forms to fill in. In fact, it was a fraudster's daydream, really, because it enabled fraud. We're not going for that, and that's why we want to make it clear. Whilst it can look like it's not fair because this particular thing should be exempt or that should be zero rated. From our point of view, the simplest the better, because it enables us then to keep costs down. It enables businesses to be able to deal with it far more easily, and it's not that thing where it's passed on from one person to another, which is effectively the end user in the UK is paying the most.
John,
just taking that point, I went around the post office, 18 months ago, which showed at the post office. The stuff that was coming in from outside, it was incredible. It was incredible. And it was from 2 or 3, we all know who they are, 2 or 3 suppliers. They would be very easy to pinpoint.
Just to add on the simplicity point there, I think it's probably worth noting, when Peter referenced the Director of Revenue Service, I think it was, that came across from Jersey, to give a brief demo of what they do and how much it costs, etc. And they actually had a copy of the GST return that businesses have to do. And it was one side of A4 and it was 6 questions, and that was it. That was their GST return. So it's in terms of being simple, it can't really get much more simple than that.
Businesses reclaim the GST in your proposals?
Well, anyone that's registered for GST, yes, you can. So in the same as anywhere else, if that's the case. So, but if you're unregistered, of course. The other thing, of course, in fact, it's also worth pointing is that in Jersey, most of the businesses fall below that threshold. I'm not sure if it's 300,000. I'm looking to the back of the room. They're nodding. It's 300,000 in Jersey as well. But most fall below that threshold and don't have to do so. But actually, a majority of businesses actually decide to register for GST because it's simple, and that means, of course, they can then reclaim it.
So that means that individuals can't reclaim it, but businesses can?
Yeah, you won't be registered for GST as an individual.
That's starting to feel a bit unfair.
Businesses are really paying the GST on their margins. So if they're buying something in that GST has already been paid for,
yeah,
and selling it on to somebody else at a 20% profit margin, if you were to levy the whole GST on the whole of the sale price, you'd be putting 180%.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it has to be their margin. So what they're able to reclaim is what they, yeah. So
it's much simpler than VAT. Yeah.
But not as end users.
No, because they're not selling it on.
Yeah, everyone's getting it at the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hang on, I'll wait for the microphone.
Sorry, I think it's not entirely clear. I mean, I used to do a lot of VAT in the UK, and basically it's the difference between what you buy and then what you pass on to your customer. That's what you reclaim. So it's not like you get free VAT. It's only the bit in between, basically. But obviously, the end user pays whatever that final price is, but there's no possibility of reclaiming that at that stage, if that makes it any clearer.
If you look at the system they brought in Jersey, which I mean ours would be obviously very similar to, it is a much simpler system administratively for businesses, and on the basis that they've been able to do that, it would be for us as well.
I'd like to ask another question, if I may, and this is to do with the taxation on businesses. You haven't really gone into much detail. I haven't had a chance to read your document that you've produced now, but I'd like to know a bit more about what kind of level of taxation you're going to put on business profits. We've been through situations in the past, we learn a lot from history, where we had high inflation. I can remember back in 1979 paying nearly 20% on my mortgage interest. We've been through situations where we've had high energy costs, again, back in 1973, 75, when we had the 3-day week, if you remember. But what we did have in those days was corporation tax, and Guernsey businesses, whatever their level, paid tax on their profits. Now, the situation was done away with. I can't remember the exact year, but it was probably, 15 years ago or so, we went to 0-10. The states are very good at a kind of what I call a knee-jerk reaction. At that time, there was concern, not just in Guernsey, but in Jersey and in the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man decided to do away with corporation tax, but they had the benefit of VAT receipts that the British government were collecting on their behalf at the time, and that was about 20%. Jersey immediately took concern they were going to lose business, and so they decided to go 0-10, and then Guernsey followed suit. It seems to me that that is when our black hole really got generated. And at the moment, if I have shares, let's say in Blue Diamond, I would pay tax on the income I get from the dividends. But the company itself is not paying any form of taxation at all on its profits. Now, they've done very well, and I'm not here to criticize or not one way or the other. But I don't suspect for 1 minute that the Specsavers of this world or the Blue Diamonds of this world would run away out of Guernsey if we introduced and went back to what we were doing before. I think I'm right in saying that Deputy Parkinson has written papers on this subject. I would like to have heard what he had to say about this, and no doubt he will be bringing this up in your debate when it comes in January. But what form of taxation are you talking about? What level of taxation are you talking about on Guernsey companies, on their profits?
Just about the historical analysis, really, you're right. I mean, I wasn't in the States in 2007, 2008. I was in the States from 94 to 2000 when the money was gushing in, and we had surpluses of 30, 40, 50 million. That stopped in about 2008. The reason it stopped was because international pressure said you can't do what you were doing anymore, and we had to change our tax system. It wasn't something that, I think Lyndon Trott was either Treasury Minister or Chief Minister at the time. And he did a good job in bringing it in, but it wasn't something anybody did with joy. Now, part of the tax thing is where we can tax at 20%, which is the rate you and I pay on our income, we'll do that. Where we can't, because because the business would flow away, then we'll tax at a different rate. It is set out in the Ernst & Young report as to what we got, and I think, Dave, you're looking at some figures.
Yeah, there really isn't time to go into it here. It's just for reference, it's on Appendix 3, Section 5, where all of them are listed from going away from the 0, 10, 20 regime that we currently have, obviously with some exceptions for fiduciary businesses and regulated businesses, etc., to other sectors that may be drawn into that, to pay tax where they currently don't pay. Yep. To talking about the OECD corporate tax, the base erosion profits sharing regulations, which may or may not be coming in. That's at that 15% flat corporate rate. Now, whether those, I think, have stalled somewhat. Originally, I think most of the countries seem to race to accept that. I understand now that some of them are starting to pull away from it, having meant what it might mean for their jurisdiction themselves. But anyway, that's ongoing. I think that's Pillar 2 of that. Again, looking for, nodding at the back, yes, it's Pillar 2 of those suggestions. But as I say, there are probably 40 pages of it, of the options that are being placed out there by E&Y. They're all very detailed. They're all very talked about elasticities of what you might lose in terms of your business locally if you put X in and Y in and Z in. I'm just sorry, we really don't have time to go into all of those things. But broadly, it's about what else can be brought into the 20% or 10% brackets that are currently not in those brackets, plus the 15% models otherwise, plus increases in the levies that all Guernsey companies currently pay. So they're all in there. But as I say, we really don't have time to go into all of them right now. But Appendix 3, Section 5 is where you'll find those.
Well, what we definitely can't do is go back, even if Specsavers wouldn't mind, we can't go back to the old system that we had before 2006 because it was deemed to be not compliant with international tax competition rules, and it would still be not compliant with those rules. But we will be looking to raising about an extra 20 million through corporate taxes. But as explained, actually, it's not just corporate taxes. The business sector would take quite a big burden of the extra social security payments because the employer's rate will go up and they will pay a fair significant amount of the GST as well. So when you combine all of that, actually we'll be raising far more from the corporate sector than we will do from individual households.
I mean, if I can just add to that as well, it's perhaps a different way of coming to the same sorts of objective in the end, that those that benefited from that change in system will actually, those companies will pay. They'll just do it in a slightly different way. At the moment, if you look at consumption taxes or something like a GST or VAT, the Isle of Man raises 40% of its revenues from its VAT, because it's obviously got a common purse with the UK. In Jersey, the equivalent, obviously GST, 8% of its revenues come from that source. Currently in Guernsey, 0. So that's where the key focus does need to be. If we did put these measures in, we would be aligned with Jersey in terms of the percentage of our income.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name
Sorry,
is Andy. Yeah, Peter. We know each other for many years. Just two minor points, because you know I like to give a different version of events. Your first four cases that you've got on the paper, that people wouldn't be paying any tax at all in Jersey, out of curiosity. And I know two people who work for a UK company and they pay UK tax. They wait for the UK tax to come in and then they pay the Guernsey tax, and they both have to pay more to the Guernsey tax than the UK tax. Just a minor point. But I'd like to come to government, the civil service and the government employees. An individual who you will well know was taken on by the states as a part-time individual, and he offered to pay 50% of what they were going to pay him, but he wanted to go on performance-related pay because he felt that the income that he could generate additional would be at least 7 figures, and he'd hoped to get an 8-figure generated income for the states. He was rejected because he worked for the states and he could not go on a performance-related pay. That, to me, means that you've probably got a lot of dissatisfied people in the civil service, because in the private sector, performance-related pay, you perform. If you perform, that's it. I mean, I've been in jobs where they turned around and said, you're going to turn our business round. What happens if you don't? Well, you sack me. You know, in fact, I'll be walking out the door before. So what I would turn around to you and say is, how, when Deputy Trott originally gave in, he told me that one of the things that they would do is they'd cover costs. They'd look after costs. If you haven't got performance-related pay in an organisation, you are going to have inefficiencies. That needs to come in. You need to. My challenge is, can you change the state's salaries, their terms of employment, so that they then have something to work for as an individual basis?
Deputy Mahoney, who looks after these matters for us.
Yeah, I'll come back with another point after.
Okay, sure. I think, yes, but it's a very slow-moving beast. The T's and C's, the terms and conditions from the states, I agree, from someone that's worked for 30, 40 years in the private sector, are arcane. And I agree entirely. In fact, we had an example with some, I won't name the department, a department that had done an amazing job after a very large event, and people were genuinely working 20-hour days for weeks and months on end. And when that was finished successfully, I went to HR and said, we've got to make it up to these guys. There must be some performance number that we can give them that sort of suggests that they've done a great job, and the answer was no. Now, that is a team of people that had worked tirelessly over a period of months to do something, and I couldn't send them out for a meal because that wasn't in the T's and C's. That's clearly entirely wrong and against every sort of attempt to get the best from our workers, and I agree entirely that it breeds an element of, well, it doesn't matter what good a job I do, I get the same pay at any event. So that's something that fairly recently, I have to be honest, the head of public service has been asked to look at, along with the head of HR, about how do we get that culture change, how do we force that and drive that down into the entire organisation. So that's being led by the strategic leadership team. So they have been put on notice to do that, and I agree entirely that's exactly the way we should be going.
Your second point.
Have you ever, do the chief officers have objectives?
Well, that's an old phrase. I don't recognise the phrase from this term as a chief officer.
Basically, an objective is... yeah, well, no, I don't like targets. Targets are specific items that you can actually turn around and say, tells 10,000 of these, and then you get a thing. I'm talking about objectives of actually achieving a type of tasks.
There's certainly, we have now much more accountability in the public sector, established staff. And if people are not meeting those, then action has to be taken against that.
Okay. Thank you.
Other points I'll raise with you later, Peter.
It's just coming up. It's 9:30. We're according to this clock. It's 25 to 11, but I think they haven't changed the clock yet. So it's 25 to... I'll take one or two more questions. There's a gentleman... I don't know where I'm looking. Gentleman... Oh, you've got your... Sorry, apologies.
Good evening. My question was going to be about the timing of this. Now, thank you everybody on the stage who said that whereas they once were not in favour of GST, they've looked at the facts and have now argued and now turned and are arguing for it. Of course, the electorate doesn't have that opportunity. We voted for people who stood on mandates of not increasing tax. And if I understand correctly, and I've not read the BA yet, that this will be brought through before the end of this electoral term. If that is the case, would the members of PNR acknowledge that this, one way or another, is likely to become an election issue, whether that's because you're putting it through before and then new candidates will say, no, this is rubbish, we never voted for it, we want to do away with this. Or will you allow a referendum on this quite divisive point during this present term?
I can speak for myself. I wouldn't be in favour of a referendum on whether we should have GST or not. Because a referendum is only a yes or no answer. Do you want to leave the EU or not, for example? Or do you want to join the EU or not, or European Union all those years ago or not? It isn't a yes or no answer, so I wouldn't favour of it. You're right, it may well be an election issue next time. Fair enough. If it is, it is.
John, I think we've spoken about this previously. There's already things that are election issues. 6 months ago, I had discussions with various people that were saying they couldn't vote for something because of 2025. Now, that was 6 months ago, 3 years out from an election. So some people are already looking over their shoulders, and it wasn't related to this. So that I don't understand personally, but there we go. That's what everyone elected. And again, in terms of referendum, I think I sit with Chief Minister that how many do you have? You have a yes, no for, do you want GST? That's a fairly easy tick box. Right now, but the next question must be, so do you want to lose hospital wing or a school? Tick box. And then the next one's got to be 100 staff or 200 staff. It's not a yes-no question, unfortunately. On the face of it, it is, but what follows is then, needs clearing up.
Okay, I'll take one more question, and then, because of the hour. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your time. Yeah, thank you for your time. Can I just make a very quick point? I only read about this in the press just hours before coming to the meeting. Could I just ask that the communication about these events just goes out a little bit earlier so that more people can be aware? So that's just the first point. Second point, I think Bob mentioned about VAT, which is value-added tax. Everyone's talking about GST. I assume you're talking about a goods and services tax and not a general sales tax. Is that correct? Because there is a difference between them. Yeah? Okay. And the last thing, your leaflet did actually drop through my door. I'm in St Sampson's. So thank you for that. I had a quick look at it. The numbers didn't seem to quite add up because some of the paragraphs said you'll be this better off for this better off for that. But then when you add the numbers on the back, it didn't seem to quite add up for the medium salary. They're saying 37,000. And just a suggestion based on Andy's proposal for performance-related pay, how about all states members taking a slight pay cut to the median earnings, and then if the economy does well, then you will get a pay rise? Just a thought.
Yeah, I think it's a fair thought. Trouble is, and I'm not one of them, there are some states members that it's their career. They go into the States and they're going to be in the States forever if they can, and they're not going to rock any boats. It's their career. It's not my career.
I think anybody that's put forward the package this evening has probably come to terms with the fact that it may not be a long-term career, but that's just an observation.
But, yeah, sorry, and then just come back to you and then carry on.
Just one other very quick thing. I believe the states have got a property portfolio worth over £1 billion, probably more in today's market. If you could sell some of that off, then you've got a secondary revenue because you'll be able to reap TRP on it when you put it into the private sector. Is that an area that you've looked at? I know it's not huge, but every little helps, as Tesco say.
Yeah.
Well,
Deputy Mahoney deals with that.
$1 billion is a huge amount, but unfortunately, it's the airport, it's a bunch of schools, it's the hospital, it's the harbour, things that we really can't sell off. So in terms of disposable property, then yes, we have some, and yes, there is a programme for getting rid of those. I think P&R have sold 3 or 4 of those in the last 6 months and cashed that money. So it's really not a case of just looking, saying it's 1 billion, flogged a lot, and happy days, because we need the schools, airports, harbour, and all those things. So most of the value is in those.
Hang on, you could put the mic for that.
You obviously save on the maintenance costs as well.
Yeah,
as well as getting a TRP on it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that's why there have been some various properties which we could have either spent money renovating, but they really weren't fit for purpose. So the best thing is to get rid and then use that money wisely for other projects, property projects, by the way. They're all known by States Property Services, and I have the list of those that we are working through. So, but thank you pointing those out. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm very grateful to you for attending and staying here till 20 to 10, and for the people listening. Thank you very much. The doors are open. We're more than willing to listen to what people have got to say, because this will be an interesting and important debate in January. But thank you very much for coming tonight.